Welcome to But Jesus Drank Wine.
And other stories that kept us stuck. I'm Mead.
And I'm Christy.
In this podcast, we'll explore the stories that kept us, stuck, wanting to drink and not wanting to drink all at the same time.
Join us as we show you that freedom from alcohol does not have to mean a life sentence of misery and missing out,
but actually means living an authentic life full of peace, joy, and purpose.
We're back.
Hi, Jolene.
Hi.
Hi, guys.
Guys, we're so excited for part 2 of our interviews with Jolene Park. If you missed the first one, go back and definitely listen to that one, because this one's going to be a little bit different. We are going to dive into Jolene's spiritual, transformation, awakening journey, all of this good stuff, which is how I recently came across Jolene. I've always followed you, but got really excited when I started reading about this on your Substack. So just a really quick recap. Jolene is a functional nutritionist, a health coach. She pioneered the gray area drinking kind of label and all of the good stuff that went with that. She has a great method called Nourish, where she helps people who want to regulate their nervous system in breaking free from alcohol. And she's just coming up to 9 years alcohol free. And so we're so excited to have you back. Thank you for joining us again.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited and a little trepidatious about stepping into this conversation, because what's interesting is we talked about it in the other interview, and it's such the top conversation was in so much coaching of a bit of that fear and hesitation of not drinking and then going into social situations and all of that. But the reality is like we talked about in the other conversation, most people drink in the gray area. It's the majority. And I'm also very aware that this conversation that we're now stepping into, the spiritual conversation, this is more the minority. So yeah, but I'm ready to talk about this.
Yay. Well, do you want to just start with where it all kind of started for you, where you began to go on this reawakening, or do you want to take us back a little bit further on what kind of led you before this? Or I don't know where the best place to start is, but what do you think?
I think I'll quickly give a bit of my history, because I think then it leads into how I kind of got where I am today.
Love that. Yeah.
Just really quickly, I grew up in the Protestant Presbyterian church, went to church with my family every Sunday. But I called us, I'd say we were pew warmers, where it was just part of what we did. You went to school, you went to church. And it was a good experience. I had no kind of church hurt or trauma, which I recognize is out there. It's so legit. I really understand people who have gone through those pieces. I didn't have that, but we just went through the motions. I didn't read the Bible with my family. We didn't, we just went to church. We'd hear scripture being read, but that was the long and the short of it. There was nothing bad or traumatic about the experience, but there wasn't anything deeper into the experience. And so when I was in my 20s and in college and living on my own, I would describe myself, always have been, still am, a seeker. And I wanted more. And I actually went to London and lived and worked there after college. And in London found, they called them spiritualists. So some psychics and some energy workers. I went to some new age stores, and that was my first experience. And I was like, wow, had my astrology chart read. And I was like, well, this is cool. This is the spiritual world I didn't know about. And really then for the next 30 years, from early 20s until my late 40s, 50, I would define myself in kind of that spiritual but not religious world. And was really interested in it as a seeker. I would read a lot of spiritual kind of new thought books. I went to a unity church, which was metaphysical. So they would use the Bible, but they would interpret it all very metaphysically. So it was kind of this, it's Christ consciousness, and it doesn't matter if Jesus walked the earth or not. It's what he represents, and he's just a master teacher, and did yoga practices that were spiritual. So it was this whole, I was never rejecting spirituality. I never considered myself an atheist or even agnostic. I'm spiritual. I wanted more. I wanted to go deeper. But I wasn't also drawn to real like legalistic churches. Like I was aware of that type of church. And I was like, well, I don't want that. The church I grew up in was just kind of bland, but it didn't kind of do things. It was very neutral for me. But then the spiritual is like, oh, there's so much here. And so that's my history with things. In my late 30s, also right when I was really at the peak of my drinking, I walked away from everything spiritual. I had a really bad yoga experience. I wrote about it in my Substack. And so I walked away from it all. I rolled up my yoga mat, which I was really associating. That was my spiritual life. I wasn't going to any kind of church, hadn't gone for quite a while to a traditional church. That was years ago, or even a metaphysical church. And because of that yoga experience, it was just such a bad taste in my mouth. I'm like, I'm done. I'm just nothing spiritual, nothing energetic. I'm walking away from it all. And I did. And I also drank the most during that time. And I didn't kind of put those pieces together until I look back now. But that was also, I feel like that was a part of, I was very spiritually disconnected. I had no anchor and I was drinking with a vengeance. And I was like, this is what people do. I just like, why am I so, there was an exhausting kind of going through this, doing all the practices. And I'm like, I'm just going to live. I'm just going to drink and go out with my friends. It's what people do. Like, and so I did it. And then I quit drinking when I was 43. And so that was 2014. And I think it was 2000, trying to think here. I think it was 2017. So it was still a couple of years into not drinking. Spiritual, it just wasn't there. It was completely void in my life. But it just dawned on me about England. I had such great experiences of England 20 years earlier and had gone to cathedrals and church services and really liked it. And when I stopped drinking, I said, I'm going to go back to England now every year because I don't have kids. I'm not paying for soccer uniforms and schools. And so why am I not going to England once a year? I'm not spending money on alcohol. I'm going to do it. And so I went to England and started going back to the cathedrals and would go to some services. I was just drawn to that old tradition and liked it. And when I came back to Denver, I was like, oh, well, there's the Episcopal Cathedral. Like this is like the Church of England. I'm going to go here. And that was 2017. And I remember just kind of weeping, the first service I went into. And I was like, oh, this has just been missing. And no one was more surprised than myself that I would come back to a traditional church. And then there was a Celtic service in the evenings on Sunday. So I didn't even go to the traditional service. I'd go to the more Celtic kind of mystical service. And so it was a slow, real process of kind of that bridge of some of the new thoughts, spiritual stuff to nothing, to some of the mystical, but now I'm in a church. And then when I moved to Charleston, found, similar, like I go to it's the oldest church here in Charleston, was founded from the Church of England in the 1600s and just wept, hearing like the old hymns, like the mighty fortress and be thou my vision. And it's like there's this cellular knowing for me. And I also recognize that so many people have rejected, this is what I'm saying, stepping into this conversation. I think it's much easier to talk about not drinking than to talk about going back to a traditional church. And I'm so aware of the whole time, the years of I would read the memoirs and so many people who had come from kind of traditional churches and left and wrote about it and speak out about it and coming away from it. And I felt like I'm swimming the other way on the stream, which is a real minority. Like there's not a lot of people going this way, coming from spiritual religious, going back to traditional Christianity. But it's fed me and it's nourished me, and I would go and I would initially tell my friends, I'm like, but I'm not a Bible thumper, I'm not, but it's just so feeding me in a way that so surprised me because I had associated church with kind of that. I was like, it's simple-minded. Like it's just this tall tale as like you read the Bible. And as it's been a very slow process over the last couple of years, but no one's more surprised than me at this stage and age in my life that I've come back to this traditional place. And I think more, I just feel better than I ever have in my life.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that so much. Tell us about reading the Bible cover to cover for the first time and what that was like.
Well, so, another thread through this whole process is no one evangelized to me. No one, I feel like some of the language of accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior and the walk with Jesus, to me, that language feels just like the language of I'm an alcoholic or recovery or it's disease. Like that language we reject as gray area drinkers, that language still doesn't set with me. And so if anyone during this process would have said, you need to accept Jesus, it's I don't know, it doesn't kind of set right with me.
I get
But what happened was I was having tea with a friend 2 years ago here in Charleston, and she said, "Oh yeah, I'm reading through the Bible right now, and I'm in Samuel." And my head spun around. I'm like, "You read the Bible?" And I had met her from church. We were going to church together for a couple months. But I'm like, "Wait a minute. I don't understand." It just seems, it's like my grandma read the Bible. How do you get any nourishment out of this? I'm like, "What do you mean you read the Bible?" And so then she told me about reading through it in a year. And so I was so intrigued, and I started kind of researching that there's you read through the Bible chronologically in a year. And I told one of my good friends who's gone to church all of her life, she said, "Oh, well, you should check out the Bible Recap by Tara Lee Cobble." And it's just been the best. I've written about it on Substack. It's just been the best thing. Sitting down and just trying to read the Bible on my own, I wouldn't get, when I listened to Tara Lee recap it on her podcast, I'm like, I didn't get this. This is so fascinating. And reading the whole arc of the story and then going to Israel this summer and seeing these places, it's like, oh, this isn't a tall tale. I've been deconstructing a lot of, it's just a myth and it doesn't really, Jesus probably didn't even exist. I had learned that over 30 years. And then you read it and it's like, this is better than any reality TV. I mean, the Old Testament. And again, no one told me, you have to read the Bible.
Yes.
But once I was interested, I was like, I want to know the story. I've heard scriptures read through church for 50 years, but I don't know the whole story. And I just I can't get enough of it. It's just so interesting to really understand and then actually see the places when I went to Israel, and it just all comes together.
Oh my gosh, there's so much I can relate to in your story, Jolene, with kind of that, thinking about the motivation almost in a sense behind picking up the Bible, where for me, and my story is similar-ish and growing up in the church, but it not really, doing anything for me. I mean, we went, that's what we did, but almost it was this is just what we do. Almost similar to the drinking, but it's just what we all do. And without ever really stopping to question, why am I doing this? And what is the purpose behind this? But the way that you say, reading the Bible and how, because that's been my experience. I cannot get enough of reading the Bible now, whereas it used to be something I did because I should do. It's something that if I claim Christian status, I know about Jesus, I know about God, I know about Jesus, that language of accepting Jesus as Lord and Savior of your heart, Lord and Savior of your life, all of that, that used to be something that made me uncomfortable, but there's a difference now. And I mean, it's really, I think the difference between living with the Holy Spirit and not, right? And knowing from our heads versus knowing literally in our hearts and being inhabited in our hearts by the Spirit. But I think that's the piece that until it's not I didn't know that I wasn't doing Christian right. Not that there's a wrong or right way. I didn't know there was so much more, but that seeking is such a big part of that. And sometimes seeking and ending up in the places that don't end up ultimately feeding us, like alcohol or new age spiritual stuff. Because I for sure, went down the self-help kind of world for a while too. And then being able to come back and have this experience where it's no, this is this is it, and I can't get enough of this, and this is sustainable. This will last, not unlike the drinking and the new age or spiritual. So, and then relating to the Israel, being able to go to Israel and then lock these places and having that still show up now in a way that's so different than before. That was never on my bucket list to go to Israel. I don't that, like 10 years ago, would that have been on your bucket list? It would have been like Greek Isles or, south of France, like fancy, but Israel, no. Yeah.
Same. Because I really, people will talk about deconstructing their Christian faith. I've been deconstructing my spiritual but not religious beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
I really learned that it doesn't matter if Jesus walked the earth or not. He's just a master teacher. And it wasn't until I got to Israel, like we're on the pilgrimage, on the trip. And my minister said, well, wait till we go, next week we're going to go. You'll be able to stick your hand in the hole where the cross went in the ground. And I'm like, what? And then it's like, oh, come on. Like, how do we know they didn't just kind of stick a flag and say, here's the tourist? But the carbon dating, the archaeology, like the crusaders through the history, the oral, like they know this spot and how it's been. The history is pretty undeniable and then the other thing there's a lot that has been part of this journey for me. Elisa Childers, I think I'm saying her name right. She wrote Another Gospel. And that book was really powerful for me. I mean, she talks about like the evidence, the hard evidence. And there's a couple of people who have written, they were like police detectives who started kind of investigating Christianity. And like, I didn't realize that there's actually hard, solid evidence. And then when you go to Israel and it's like, I stuck my hand in the hole where not holy, I can never say the name of the church. How do you say it?
Holy Sepulchre. Now I can't. Now I'm afraid to say it. Like, yeah, Sepulchre, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so seeing the history and it's like, oh, this is real. And I'm still I'm like deconstructing that a bit because I was really indoctrinated that it didn't matter if it was real. It's just a myth. Yeah. But we learned the message from the myth. And so other pieces that helped me was I did a C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis, I knew C.S. Lewis wrote the Narnia Chronicles, but I didn't realize all the other books and that C.S. Lewis himself was a hard atheist at Oxford, a real intellectual. Like I didn't know that story about him. And then, so I have one of my ministers here is a huge C.S. Lewis expert and teaches about him. And when I first came here, I listened to one of his series on the Screwtape Letters, which I'd never heard of that book until 2 years ago. And listening to that class on the Screwtape Letters was really impactful to me of how C.S. Lewis, wrote. And then I did a C.S. Lewis Fellows program. So it wasn't necessarily C.S. Lewis books. Some were C.S. Lewis books, but it was a really well curated program of just month to month. It was like such a good foundational primer for me of looking at prayer and the Holy Spirit and mercy and grace. Like I didn't understand, and I know people have the trauma and the hurt, and it is so legitimate. Like I'm not denying it at all. It's awful what some people have gone through with the church, but kind of that fire and brimstone, purity thing. I didn't know the mercy and the grace, but I didn't know it until I read the Bible. And so it's like really learning some of these foundational pieces. And again, no one said, do this or you need to be saved or you need to, it's just on my own reading and study and exploration, this world of like Oxford academics who are really strong Christians. Like they're very smart intellect. I didn't know there was this whole intellectual world that it's like studied the history of it and that was, I needed that. I needed that intellectual Christian world because I had that association with kind of the legalistic, bubblegummy surface.
Same.
It's just, yeah. So all of that. And again, it's so interesting how it all dropped in perfectly when I needed it. And I'm still in the process. I'm still learning. It's not like I was struck by a bolt of lightning, but the more I read, the more I am involved, the more I want. And one thing I think is ironic is I came from kind of that like mystery schools, find the mystery schools, the spiritual mysticism. And I'm like, but the thing that we completely turn away from and haven't even read, there's so much in that, which is the Bible. You don't know it until you read it. And I feel like if there's any mystery or anything that's been hidden, because I know there's always, it's like, what's been hidden? What are the hidden secrets and stuff that's been kept from women? And it's the Bible. Is the irony to me.
Oh, it's so cool. And I think about how not coincidental it is that this happened after you found freedom from alcohol, because because that was the same for me. I mean, I claimed Christian status. I mean, I was confirmed at 13 in the Episcopal Church. Like I was giving my life, for like, and taking Jesus into my heart. Like I was doing all of that. I thought, but I was missing that relationship piece because my idea of God was more authoritative, and authority without the loving kindness part, right? And so I kind of resisted that for a little while, for a long while, and then came back around after finding freedom from alcohol. And I think it's not coincidental that this is, it's almost like, and maybe, I don't know if you would say this or not, but it's like I had to do it my way. Like it couldn't have been all the people telling me this is how to do it. And I had people in my life that were like, this is how you need to do it. And like, do this. And I almost needed to do it my own way and make the mistakes and figure out why the new age, the self-help wasn't the way. So I could have that kind of concrete proof as to like, this is not what is going to sustain me, to come back around. And then now, free from alcohol, wide awake, fully alert, completely in the here and the now, in the present, no longer kind of keeping things just bubbling underneath the surface, and allowing myself to really ask those hard questions, get curious about like, what do I believe and why do I believe it? So if I don't feel that relationship, why don't I have a relationship with Jesus? Do I feel like it's not possible? Is it still just abstract to me? Is it just still this head knowledge? And how do I get that? Is there something more? It's like the curiosity. That's one of the things that I find most surprising about finding freedom from alcohol, is how curious I am now and how open I am to looking at all the things and being okay with whatever answer comes, and how often that answer points me right to Jesus every single time. And so I love thinking about how your journey, not coincidentally, maybe was the same kind of awakening in a sense that happens after we find freedom from alcohol.
There's so many similarities with it, because just like alcohol, how we all have those associations of those extreme stereotypes, and we're like, well, and the language of, well, that's not me. I'm not that person.
Yes.
It's the same with, there's Christian language that still, like, I mean, I'm in, like, I'm with God. And there's this language where it's like, that doesn't, because I do have negative associations around it. But then just like with alcohol, there's this whole other world I didn't even realize. And as I pieced it together around, it's about the physiology, it's about the brain, it's about which helped me so much and has helped others so much. And then I've found the same thing with this conversation of, there's this whole other world I didn't realize. Like there were so many people that I've learned about in 2 years. I have had no idea. I'm like, how did I get to 50 years old? And not like, I respect these authors and these, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Elizabeth Elliot and Amy Carmichael, all of their stories. And then, these newer authors, like I mentioned, Elisa, I think it's Childers, if I'm saying her name right. I'm trying to think. It's like there's so many, and now I'm trying to like tip of my tongue. I think Paul Miller is one. Where's my book? He's written. Hold on, I'm going to lift up my screen. It's right here. Donald Whitney. Do you guys know him? He's written The Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life. Like, I just love his book. And I think he's also the author of reading through or praying through the scriptures. And he talks about praying through the Psalms. And like, I'm just like, this is incredible. Like, this is such interesting, useful, because I'm all about the practical. And so, you know, being introduced to all, I'm like, who are these people? How did I get to this point, not know them? And then honestly, hearing from other spiritual but not religious people, they're all over YouTube right now, and who've been in the wellness space, who have been in the spiritual space. And I don't know, something cracked in 2013 with alcohol. I feel like something's cracking here. And if you just, you know, go to YouTube and put in like New Age to Jesus or spiritual to, hearing them and hearing that, because it's like, oh yeah, that's exactly my experience. Like, that's what I was into and read and studied. And all of a sudden they're reading the Bible. And I remember, like, it's not like you first hear it, because at first when I'd hear, I'm like, oh, these people are nuts. Like they just went off, like, what happened to this person? But it's like with alcohol, it's something, you hear the sober curious conversation and you kind of keep it on the perimeter. You listen again, even though you're like, I can't do forever. And like, I remember I was following somebody on Instagram, and all of a sudden they went, you know, they were like me with their beliefs and started talking. And still today, I'm like, were they like kidding? Were they doing this for traffic? Did they like have a psychotic break?
Yeah. Like, yeah.
I'm like, what just happened? Like, I think they just went crazy. So I get it. I can get how people like listening to me right now can be like, what just happened to Jolene?
Yes.
But you keep listening and reading on my own. It was just like we do with alcohol. We keep listening to the podcast quietly, silently, taking it in, and then just doing my own. I mean, Tara Lee Cobble was just an amazing, healthy discovery. I just love how she takes you through the Bible of what God is doing, not in a fire and brimstone way. Yeah. And there's no way to know that except actually going through the Bible. And slowly, it's just been this little slow kind of, this is where I am.
Yeah.
And it feels
I love
really
that.
good to be right here.
Oh, I love it so much. I keep remembering something that I read this week about just, you know, you can know the scriptures, but in order to know the scriptures, you have to know the author, right? And I think the way that we all kind of originally approached, you know, the church and Christianity, it was like knowing the scriptures, but it wasn't really knowing who was behind that. And so that is what I think actually cracking open the Bible and reading it for yourself does, right? Because I won't get into my whole thing, but I was very much raised in a fire and brimstone church and didn't realize, and I'm not going to say the name of it because it's very famous, but, you know, I didn't realize what mercy and grace was until I started my own even alcohol-free journey. And I wrote down what you said, Jolene. I love the phrase cellular knowing. Me, do you always say experiential knowledge? I feel like it's a different way of saying that, and I love it so much. But I didn't have the cellular knowing that Jesus was mercy and grace until I stumbled across 2 Corinthians 12:9, his power is made perfect in my weakness, in the moment that I felt the most weak and the most broken by alcohol. And that is when the cellular knowing happened, right? Because I'm like, oh, wow, okay, surrender, this is what it is. I'm feeling the most powerful that I've ever felt, and I'm in the most broken place. And that's because I've got Jesus. Yeah.
And stories are always so powerful to me. So of course, like, I knew of Paul, that there's this guy named Paul in the Bible, but I had no idea of his story. None. Until 2 years ago. Like, I didn't know his conversion story. And there's a really good on Amazon Prime. I think I linked it in one of my Substack story, like as a resource. But it's like a little over an hour. And it's the story. I think it's pretty well done. It's the story of Paul. And I'm like, this is the coolest story ever. I mean, I didn't know. How did I get to 50 years old and I didn't know Paul's story? And one of the, we would, in my C.S. Lewis study, we would watch, it would have movies to, watch and articles. And it wasn't just C.S. Lewis. And one of the movies was Les Miserables. I'm saying that right? In the Mercy and Grace. And I had seen that play on Broadway years ago, but I didn't get it. I couldn't follow the storyline. And I watched the movie and I'm just like, this just encapsulates. I mean, again, what you're talking about, Christy, of the mercy and the grace, like when you really understand that and start to hear other people write about it and learn the stories, I didn't know. I didn't know. I know the trauma of a fire and brimstone associated God, but I didn't know that other God that's in the Bible. I mean, I love the Old Testament. I remember people would be like, oh, geez, just wait till you get to Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Like, it's just all over. You just quit. I loved it. Like, the story it's better than reality TV. It's like these people in the old. And so that's interesting to me of how we get into like this purity culture and this we have to do. And it's like, no one in the Old Testament is a purist. I mean, it's just a hot mess. And like, it's like, oh, it makes so much sense. Like our world makes so much sense when I read the Old Testament.
All of that stuff, it's so interesting, right? All of the laws and the legalism was man-made, right? Like those were the Pharisees and they were the ones coming and adding all the extra rules to the 10 Commandments, right? And so, but those are what we are taught is what's going to keep us on the straight and narrow and keep us doing the right thing. And that's not even, it's only by grace, right? Through faith.
But even the church is man today.
Yeah.
You know, there's accusation. They are so legitimate. Again, I don't want to deny any of it, but it's man, humans that are. It's not God.
Yeah, I think about like it's his people, right? Like we talked about, like it's the stories, it's the people that we connected to that made it real for us in a sense, versus it's like that cellular knowing, that experiential knowledge, or the somatic that we talk about, and you have do a lot of work with, Jolene. But and Kurt Thompson, one of my favorite teachers, always says this, but like until we can feel, it's like faith for the first part of my life was like 1 + 1 = 2. Like it makes sense, and so I'm a Christian, and I'll say the things that like whatever. But until you can feel deep in your chest what mercy and grace feels like, what love, true unconditional love, like not having to show up and do or be a certain way, or succeed or achieve, or all those like unconditional love, until you can feel that deep in your chest, it doesn't feel real. And it's whether we experience it through God's people who he like gives to us to help us point us back to Jesus, or through, a number of ways we can get to it, but until we feel that, it's just not made real. And I think that was something that I didn't understand. And it sounds like you can relate to. And I also was thinking about how, when you were saying like, it's like how we do with, I'm not a anti-alcohol evangelist, y'all. Like, so like, I'm not, I'm not here to preach about don't drink alcohol. I mean, I did the same thing after finding freedom from alcohol, and then stepping into this place of like real relationship with Jesus, where I'm like, I want to share it with people. And all of a sudden I am talking about it in a new way, but also, thinking in my head, like, hey, maybe people are saying like, oh, there goes me, she quit drinking and she's found Jesus. So, like some of that language and those fears that we have about being labeled as the crazy person for all of a sudden, like all of that, how that can keep us from experiencing what is just, and thank God it hasn't kept us from experiencing the abundance of walking with Jesus. But yeah, it's so relatable. And I think this conversation is relatable to a lot of folks too.
Yeah, I feel it with tears. I'm not a crier for the most part. And pretty much every service I sit in with the old hymns, with the message, which is just telling a story in the Bible, I pretty much cry every service. And that's like, to me, that's the Holy Spirit's moving through my cells. And I just find the story, like, I love the story of Jesus in the boat with the disciples. And so in June, I was on the boat in the Sea of Galilee. It's like, it really exists. Like, there's really this, I think that's what keeps blowing my mind, that it's just not some far off fairy tale. And just that story of like, going back to the anxiety and alcohol and all of the things, trying to shoulder through and do it. And I mean, in that story, there's that storm. So the storm of life, and the disciples are being thrown here, and like, understandably so. I would be freaking out as well. And Jesus is in the boat sleeping. And there's a picture, Rembrandt was, he did a lot of sacred paintings. And I really love the picture that Rembrandt painted of this scene. And Jesus is in the boat, and he's like, I'm right here. I've always been right here. And it's like stuff like that just gives me, because again, even some of that, like a relationship with Jesus is like, what does that mean? But it's like the story, it's like, oh, that's what he's in this boat with me. Whatever storm I'm going through, whatever, like that just really, it means something. And it brings tears of like, he's always been right here. Even when I was thrashing around with alcohol and winding down this spiritual spiral over the years, he was always right there with me. And all of the stories, they're just so relatable. And so they apply so much to today.
Yeah. So true. I always, this was a big awake. I'm like, of course, that's what it is. He was always with me. He has always been with me. The only thing that kept me from being able to feel that, to access that, was me. It's not that he wasn't there. It's that and I love how Kurt Thompson, he talks about this too. It's like, God doesn't come as this angry, like, dictator that we have in our heads of like, we're afraid. Like he's not going to force his way into our lives. He's there. It's up to us to open to, relationship with him. And what does that? That was I'm like, what? I don't even understand what that means. Like, what is a right relationship with God? Like, I don't get that. But now that I have it, I know exactly what it is, but it is hard to articulate. And it does absolutely lead me to tears more times than not in situations where I am, experiencing the presence, the fullness of the Holy Spirit. And it is hard but that's our mind wanting to go to, like, I have to make sense of this. And that's what's kind of cool about it too, is there's really no way to actually make sense of it in a way.
Well, and that's some of my passion around this right now, because I've, just like alcohol, I've quietly been here for 2 years, and now just starting to speak, because that's what I have to do. I have to let it kind of germinate for myself before I feel confident to speak. But just like alcohol, I feel like there were these missing pieces that if that could have been there for me. And what I mean by missing pieces, like, I remember when I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this, read the Bible through in a year. Like, I want to know the whole arc of I want to learn the story. And then I think my friend even said, she's like, well, I would recommend getting this version. I'm like, wait a minute, there's a different version of the Bible? Like, I didn't know that there's, and then I'm like, well, how do you choose? And that there's different denominations in the Protestant church. And I don't know sometimes that people realize, like, under the Christian church, there's the Roman Catholic, but then all the Protestant denominations. And then even my friend sent me a thing of like, okay, so there's so many books that are in the Bible that are history, so many that are poetry, so many. And I'm like, I don't really remember learning that.
Knew?
Like that was really helpful. She sent this to me. And so I just feel, and then even just the basics, without dogma, without kind of one denomination or church, but just like these fundamentals of mercy. And it's not attached to, I'm doing like air quote church, but just learning that, it's like, that's missing. Because again, when you hear like a relationship with Jesus, and it's like saying I'm an alcoholic, it's like, what is that? Now what do you do? Mm-hmm. And the language, I think, just gets really vague and ambiguous and convoluted, and or like even, sharing the gospel. What are the God? And so just that, the like basics is going back to the foundations, like what I do with the physiology, you go back to the basics, and then you decide. Then you have the somatic experience. Here's some of the basics. You get to decide. You run it through your nervous system, but you have to have something to actually run through your nervous system. Mm-hmm. And we need to get more practical, I think. And you've mentioned Kurt Thompson. I'm sure you've mentioned him before. On your...
Once or twice. Oh my gosh.
So he's another one in this. There's like got to be at least 50 people in 2 years who I never knew were out there, and they are such amazing people. And Kurt Thompson's one of them. I heard him speak about a year ago in Charleston. It was hands down one of the best keynote speakers I've ever heard in my life. I mean, he combines the real practical, not preachy, fear type stuff, but such a solid, calm, grounded relationship with the neuroscience. And I had said that, I'm like, I want to combine like this neuroscience with this Christian spiritual. Does anybody do that? And then here I landed in a Kurt Thompson lecture. So for those listening, if you've heard me talk about it, like go listen to Kurt Thompson. He is the epitome of putting together, if you have that stereotype, and I even have components of it, of like how you put this in like a rational, practical, but really rich Christian spiritual way. Kurt Thompson just speaks so well. I mean, I go on Spotify, just put his name in Spotify. He's been interviewed so many times. He's one of my favorites.
Absolutely. Hands down, agree with you. And it's funny how he came to me, and it's like, it's really neat to see. But when I was first starting to look at my relationship to alcohol, I was into the Enneagram at the time. And so I hadn't even really started exploring my relationship to alcohol. I was still like, I don't know. And I was listening to this podcast called Typology. And so then I found freedom from alcohol, and then I, start out into coaches training. And then I'm like, well, I'm not going to be working with Christian women. And so I came across Kurt Thompson's podcast interview on typology, and he was talking about soul of shame. And I'm like, I love that he's bringing in this, like, how does the biblical narrative fit with science? And, oh, wait, they don't have to be separate. And I love that. Oh, but I'm not going to be working with Christian women, so let me just put that aside. Well, I wasn't quite ready to do the work that I needed to do from like my soul standpoint. But then when my pastor mentioned his hearing this podcast on typology and this guy and, whatever, I listened to that same episode again, realizing it was, and this was like a year later. And I'm like, and it undid me in a way that was different than when I was looking at it through the lens of like professional coaching and how it would help me with that. When I was looking at it through this personal lens, and I'm going, oh my gosh, there's so much to what he's saying there. And then I started devouring his books, and when, I've been to his conferences and work with his confessional communities, and he's lovely. And he ties that together, because that was one of my big questions. Like, how can these two things exist? I can be in the psychology world, the psychology I love and I get, and I can use that in my coaching and it makes sense. But there always felt like there was just something missing from that. So for me, it was this journey too of realizing that what I thought was my missing piece, finding freedom from alcohol. There's my missing PEACE. No, that was like the beginning of that next journey of really leading to the true missing piece, which was that, all of this is blanketed by God. Of course it is. And science is, just a side part, but being able to see how it fits together is like, yes, this is where my body feels this is truth. This is real. This is, and it's such a breath of fresh air.
Totally agree. And he's such a embodied example of what I'm talking about. Of there was this world out there that I didn't know existed. And I would say, if somebody's listening saying, what are you guys really talking about? And what does all this really mean? I would say, go listen to Kurt Thompson. He's such a great example of just putting the pieces together in a really practical way, in a way that I'd never heard before, that isn't kind of the stereotypical Christian, although he is such a Christian. Yeah, he's well worth listening to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Agree.
I was just going to ask, like, what if, somebody's listening and they're wondering, like, okay, what would be the first thing to pick up? Apart from Kurt Thompson, is there any others that, I know you mentioned a bunch. It's hard to narrow it down, I know, but like for the person that's hearing all of this for the first time and thinking, and maybe been to church their whole life, like the three of us, right, in the early years, and now is like, oh gosh, okay, maybe it is time to explore who Jesus really is and what he's about. What would you say are your top tips?
say I can't emphasize enough, and this is another thing I didn't understand, is like, the living word and reading God's word. Again, that's more of that language. It's like, come on, like, what does that really mean? But I get it. And I just can't emphasize, I get it now after, reading, is Tara Lee Cobble's podcast, The Bible Recap. There's people who write about the arc of the Bible and the stories and all that, but I would just say Tara Lee Cobble, because she recaps like 3 chapters or so every day in 5 to 8 minutes. And it's like, what a really interesting story. Like, you really start to get the whole story. So I would say the Bible Recap is like my number one thing, wherever you are. Like, if you've been to church, coming back, if you've been more in kind of the spiritual but not religious and you're just curious, the Bible Recap is really the first place that I would start. And then it kind of depends, if you're coming at like my story out of that spiritual but not religious kind of new thought world, Elisa Childers' Doreen Virtue was another good one to look on YouTube. She's got, a lot of great interviews and things. But if that's not your story of that spiritual to religious thing, C.S. Lewis has really surprised me. So, and just his work and his, the connections around him, and like, so he was really good friends with J.R.R. Tolkien. I didn't really realize that. And they were both really strong Christians. And so I think just kind of reading some of their stuff, and you can go on the C.S. Lewis Institute website, and there's tons of articles and book recommendations, and I feel like it gives it's not pointing into any particular church or, I guess, dogma belief, but it just gives you, if you really want like kind of a foundational, like, okay, what are the foundations? I would look to the C.S. Lewis Institute, and I would start going through the Bible with Tara Lee Cobble and just kind of start learning the Bible story, which I just love.
Yeah. It also comes in a book, by the way. I have the book. So because I like to do it first thing in the morning, and I listen to everything else, but for the Bible Recap, there also is a book too.
Have either of y'all done the Bible Project? Have y'all used that for anything?
Yes. And actually that's I recommend that, because it's in, Tara Lee recommends that when we start a new book of the Bible.
So good.
The Bible Project has done a short little video on YouTube. Like, you can put in any book like Genesis or Ruth or James or John, and the Bible Recap or the Bible Project will do, again, like a 5 or 10 minute overview, and it's really good. And it's like, oh, this is what this book is about. So I love going and watching their videos on the different books of the Bible.
What about The Chosen? Have we talked about that? Have you watched The Chosen, Jolene?
I haven't. Have you guys watched it?
You guys haven't? Oh, I thought this was probably a stupid question, because it's so good. Yeah, I highly recommend The Chosen.
I know a lot of people who have. I haven't yet.
And not from a, like, I want to get historical facts. I mean, historical facts and, the Bible, right? But, like, if you think about, like, that kind of, like, somatic knowing, just, and seeing kind of through God's people how he works, like, it's powerful. I mean, I can relate to so many of the women in the story and picture Jesus, how he would respond to me in my life based on how it's being portrayed there. And so while maybe they take some liberties with some things, I think it's a beautiful representation of, what I didn't experientially know before quitting alcohol and finding Jesus.
And there's historical fiction books too. Have you guys read Francine Rivers' books? No. I'm working my way through one of her trilogies. It's called The Mark of the Lion, and so it takes place in Jerusalem, like in 75. I don't like 25 years after Jesus was there, and it's a historical fiction, but it's this story of like to really like it's like ooh, I feel like I'm there in that time period, and so she writes a lot of Christian historical fiction.
Good to know.
Yeah.
What was the okay, I know we have to wrap, but like, what was there were so many great things about Israel, right? I mean, and it just continues to feed me. I went back in March and it was so powerful. What is the one top thing that you got to experience there?
Well, first of all, like you, Israel was never on my bucket list. Like I never would have considered. And I was kind of like, why? I had no concept of the Middle East until I went there. So it was amazing to go. There's so much. I mean, Old City Jerusalem's incredible. So the actual site where the cross went into the crucifixion site, and then the burial site of Jesus, which is now an Orthodox church. Like there's a church built over. That was really powerful. And walking the streets in Old City Jerusalem, the path to the cross, and then before we even did that, like there was the kind of the cave indoor where the Roman soldiers held Jesus and beat him before even taking him to the cross. And what was really powerful is on the floor, it's still there, like this old Roman game. They would roll the dice, and it's where they held all prisoners, not just Jesus. And they'd be like, okay, so are we going to beat the prisoner today? Or are we going to whip wherever the dice land? That was really powerful to be in that Roman prison where Jesus was. And again, it's like, oh, come on. How do we know that he was? I mean, the carbon dating, the archaeology, the history. There's a book called The Case for Christ where like the evidence is strong. This isn't just, and I didn't know that. I just thought it's just kind of a tall tale. And then being there physically. So the Old City Jerusalem was really impactful to me. The other place that was really powerful was Caesarea Philippi. And you went there too, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So that was really impactful just because of my history of the spiritual but not religious. And it's the site where it's the gates to Hades. It's the gate to hell where they had all the idol worship. And Jesus stood right there with the disciples and he said, what do you call me? Who do you say that I am? Because I will defeat this. Like this won't stand. And so to physically see that cave, it's dark. That impacted me a lot. But I loved it all. We went to the Beatitudes site. We were on the Sea of Galilee. We were at the Dead Sea. We went to Bethlehem and, the Mount of Olives, Garden of Gethsemane. Like it was all just incredible. It's life-changing.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, I love that. I can't wait to go back.
Going back, right? I'm coming next time.
Yeah, I thought it was a one and done. So then it was never on my bucket list. And then I go and before I go, I'm like, it's a one and done. You go and you see it and you're like, okay, great. And then it does continue to feed you. Like I'm so shocked how I can, even when we're just taking communion and I can, I'm back to sitting at the garden tomb where we did receive communion and we walked into the empty tomb. And so like, it continues to feed in a way, but I'm like, no, I've got to go back. There's so much more. Yeah. There's so much more to do.
That's how I feel. Yeah. And it just makes the story so much more powerful because, I mean, it seems like every story now we're reading something in church about like Joppa, and we went to Joppa right outside Tel Aviv. And there's a lot of stories from there, places where Paul went, and it's like, and they talk about the gates of Old City Jerusalem. It's like, I know what they're talking about. Like I was right there at that gate. And so it's really powerful that it's like, it's accurate how they describe these historical places. When you stand right there on the site and read from the Bible, it's like, this is powerful. This is really, really powerful.
I'm a skeptic of all the things. And I keep finding ways to like, this can't be real, and yet I am too. I'm a questioner. I'm a rebel. That's why it's like I keep saying some of the language doesn't. I'm like, what does this mean? Like I have to I need the practical, experiential, and I've been able to find that the last 2 years with this, and that's why it's been really powerful, and I've completely changed course. All right, we're going to bring this home with this, Christy. I promise we're going to wrap with this. I just thought of this. It's the same way with the freedom from alcohol journey, where we are like the things that make us uncomfortable. Those are opportunities to get curious. Like, so don't ignore the things that make us, uncomfortable about it. Like, okay, like, I don't know about whatever it is related to freedom from alcohol. We do the same thing. We open to it, get curious about it. You can always go back to doing it the other way, right? Or whatever. It's the same thing with this. Like, so many of the things that the language that I was so averse to, like you're talking about, Jolene, like if we get curious about where our discomfort is. One of the things for me was like fearing the Lord. Like that kind of made me uncomfortable. I'm like, I was averse to that. And now through curiosity and digging into that and talking to trusted others who can help me, help explain that, I'm like, oh, that's what fear is. It's not this, because it was something that I was bumping up against in me, and something that had this opportunity to be kind of reframed, healed, recommissioned, regenerated in a sense. And inviting the Lord into that is, there's no better, more exciting way to experience peace from things that maybe we were closed off to before, or understanding that comes with it. So
I think Tara Lee describes the fear as awe and respect, like kind of the translation. Yeah. And I get that. Like there's so much awe and so much, God is so big, and so like we can't even, our human brain, there's so much awe, so much respect. And what I would say, if people who are like, oh geez, with this conversation, hopefully they've lasted this long. And because this is what I do. Instead of, like I said, there was somebody on Instagram that I was watching, and I'm like, did they just completely lose their mind right in front of me? Like, really, did they have a psychotic break? I would say, instead of blocking and shutting it down, follow because I do that. I'm like, okay, I really want to see like how ridiculous this is. Like, I really want to, like, what are they really watching and looking at? And I'll do that. And I would say to those listening, like, do it. Like, this isn't I'm not evangelizing. Follow some of the threads. Listen to some others, and just, it's just the somatic thing. And then notice because that's what I did. Like the more I kind of listen, the more it's hard to turn away, like how solid this is. So and when I think something's ridiculous, I like to follow it to prove how ridiculous it is.
Yes, I get that.
But the more I followed this, the more I was like, oh, I get it. Maybe these people aren't ridiculous. So I would challenge people to do that. If you think this is ridiculous, and I've gone off the deep end,
yes,
follow some threads and some links and see for yourself. Do what
That's
you think.
right.
You still may think it's ridiculous, but but have the experiential experience of it first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we will link all of the things that we mentioned in the show notes. And Jolene, we're just so grateful and so blessed that you were able to come and chat with us twice. And just thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for offering the platform. And I'm just like so thrilled to meet you both and know that you're walking this path.
Yay.
Yeah, we're in it together. Oh my gosh, I love it. It's so exciting. It's fun to find our alcohol-free posse, but it's to really bring in the most important part. It's to walk with other sisters is incredible.
It's the most nourishing community that I've found.
100%.
I love it. Yeah.
All
right, ladies.
Bye,
we will
y'all.
see you next Monday. Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for joining us again this week. You can find all of our episodes at butjesusdrankwine.com, and make sure you follow us over on the gram at Love Life Sober with Christy and Mead at I'm Not Sober, I'm Free.
To learn more about what we do, you can visit our websites at meadhollandshirley.com and lovelifesober.com.
Take a screenshot of this podcast and share it with a friend or two.
And don't forget to subscribe so you don't have to worry about missing a single episode. And if you love what we're doing, please leave us a review on Apple or Spotify.
This helps more women who are feeling stuck and alone in the overdrinking cycle to find hope and encouragement.
Thanks, ladies. We so appreciate you. We'll see you next week.